Welcome to ING's Think Aloud, where we try to make sense of the world in the most unbanky way we can. In today's episode,
we know that the car industry has, of course, been very badly hit during this crisis. But April's new sales figures showed us that for the first time ever, that the two biggest selling models were both electric vehicles.
UK Transport Secretary Grant Shapps says the COVID-19 pandemic has presented an opportunity to make lasting changes to the way we travel. In addition to putting walking and cycling at the heart of its transport policy, the government plans to spend an additional £10 million on car charging points, following on from its February announcement to ban all hybrid, petrol and diesel cars by 2035. I'm Rebecca Byrne, and today I'm talking about the future of car ownership with ING's Senior Economist Joanna Konings. We look at what the crisis could mean for electric cars, whether social distancing will spark a renaissance in individual transportation and put the brakes on car sharing, and whether complex supply chains could be re-engineered. Joanna, the auto sector, like every other part of the economy, is experiencing an unprecedented crisis. Just give us a sense of how bad things have been.
So the automotive industry was already really under pressure before COVID-19 even hit. The trade war between the US and China was affecting prices and confidence, and the industry has been in transition anyway with the rise of electric vehicles and a move away from car ownership to ride sharing and other types of arrangements. But then COVID-19 has come along and caused many economies to go into lockdown, and the economic consequences of that for people's incomes and their employment has really stopped the market for cars. So there have been disruptions to production and supply chains, but also a really sharp fall in demand. China was the first country to go into lockdown, and there we've seen sales of cars 80% down on the year. But in the EU and in the US, there are also really sharp falls. I think the US decline was 40% in February. So those are now larger impacts than we saw during the financial crisis.
Right, it's pretty clear the rise in unemployment has been a big factor here. It almost looks like there's a perfect correlation between unemployment and the drop in car sales. When do you think people might start to make big ticket purchases again?
Well, the experience in the financial crisis showed us that higher unemployment undoubtedly weighs on automotive sales. It's partly due to the loss in income and the uncertainty that brings with it. And in the new situation we have with lockdown, there's also just a reassessment of the need for a car or what kind of transport you're going to need in the future. But following the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008, it took vehicle sales in the US 11 months to get back to positive annual growth. And given that the impacts have been larger this time, it might take even longer.
Do you think that governments are going to step in to help the industry? Obviously, back in the financial crisis, the US had its Cash for Clunkers program. Could we see something similar, and would it really help?
I think a scrappage bonus is currently being discussed at the EU level as well as at national level. So the different countries might bring in their own programs, and that might happen faster than getting agreement at the EU level. What we might see this time is that programs will be centered around new energy vehicles, electric vehicles. So the Chinese government has already announced it will extend subsidies and purchase tax exemptions on new energy vehicles to 2022. So alongside those scrappage schemes, you might see the subsidies that are already there for electric vehicles being extended. The evidence does suggest that these schemes can help, but the boost to sales now is using up some of the future purchases that would have been made in later years. So it also dampens those purchases further out.
Right. Let's talk about electric cars a little bit more. As you were saying earlier, the car industry was obviously undergoing major changes before the coronavirus hit. There were much stricter CO2 emissions rules coming into force in Europe. China was moving heavily into electric vehicles. But what is the outlook for electric cars now, particularly given that we've seen much lower oil prices? Does that make them less attractive?
The transition to electric vehicles was definitely firmly underway before COVID-19. And at that stage, we were expecting all new car sales in Europe to be electric by 2035. Different countries are at different points along that path. But now, yes, with a lower oil price, it is a cost factor for drivers and it might influence their choices when they're ordering a new vehicle. But I don't think that it will put much of a dent in the transition to electric vehicles overall. That's partly because the current low oil prices probably won't persist for too long. And low oil prices in any case don't reach straight into lower petrol prices because of the tax part of that price. But another really important reason is that the competitiveness of electric vehicles in terms of their cost compared to old internal combustion engine vehicle, but also in terms of range, they're really becoming more competitive. And some of the newer battery electric models can reach 500 kilometers in range. So it's becoming a more attractive option for a larger number of different types of driver. And the final reason, of course, is, as you mentioned, there's a regulatory push to transition towards electric vehicles as countries are implementing their carbon emission plans to reduce emissions, and regulation by cities is probably going to increase. Electric vehicles are going to fit into that a lot more easily.
One silver lining for the car sector is that social distancing has made owning an individual car more desirable, especially among young people. Could we see a revival in interest in owning a car? Is that something that's likely to be a lasting change?
We definitely do expect the crisis to leave its mark on mobility behaviour, and some of these trends that have been going in the direction of ride sharing and not owning a car might be reversed somewhat, if only temporarily. What we have seen is that demand to own a car has increased during the COVID-19 crisis so far. Well, we can't see that in vehicle sales, obviously, but we can see it in searches for vehicles, but also in survey evidence. A survey by Capgemini in April showed that especially younger age groups are now considering buying a car where they weren't previously. And we also know that the evidence from the SARS outbreak was that the fear of risking infection led to consumers avoiding public transportation, and it ultimately increased the demand for cars.
So is that going to have an impact on car sharing and ride hailing? You were just talking about that. We heard this week that Uber is cutting more jobs. I think it's laid off roughly a quarter of its workforce.
I think we can expect that as long as social distancing requirements continues and the fear of infection is there, then owning a car will be a lower risk option and perhaps considered more attractive than ride sharing. We know again from the SARS episode, even though new types of mobility concepts weren't as widespread at that time, in Taiwan, the usage of public transport indicated a lot lower usage of shared mobility solutions, and instead people opted for the car. So if we apply that to car sharing and ride hailing, they might be something to avoid. And if social distancing is going to continue longer term, then people will need to travel and they might opt for a car.
One statistic that I found particularly interesting in the report that you wrote was that there are more than 10,000 suppliers in a vehicle's value chain. So that makes it very difficult to prepare for a shock. What can car makers do to mitigate the risks in future? Will supply chains be re-engineered?
This is a really difficult challenge in the automotive supply chain because the supply chains are run in such a lean way and they are so complex that they're really one of the most sensitive supply chains out there. And we've seen that in the COVID-19 crisis, where even though they're clustered in regional hubs, there are enough interregional linkages that disruptions in China fed through to Europe and the US really quickly. So they can mitigate risks somewhat. And one way of doing that is to have backup suppliers. But as you mentioned, with 10,000 involved, you're going to have to do a lot of work to find good backup options. And something in the car supply chain as well is that those backup options have to prove that they can produce to sufficient quality standards and safety standards to be kept on the books. So it comes with a cost. Another thing they can do is to hold larger inventories, but again that uses higher costs for storing the parts and working capital, so it doesn't come for free. So as a result, I don't think we can expect much re-engineering of the existing supply chain. With the electric vehicles coming through, though, when new supply chains are established, the memory of the COVID-19 episode might cause there to be more margin built in and try and make those supply chains a little bit lower risk.
Okay, ING's Senior Economist Joanna Konings, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rebecca.
This podcast has been prepared by ING solely for information purposes, irrespective of a particular user's means, financial situation, or investment objective. The information does not constitute investment recommendation, and nor is it investment, legal, or tax advice, or an offer or solicitation to purchase or sell any financial instrument. Read more at think.ing.com/content-disclaimer.